The second week of testimony in the trial against the former officer charged in the death of 20-year-old Daunte Wright is happening now. The Brooklyn Center officer claims she mistakenly used her gun instead of her taser during that deadly traffic stop. Now, earlier today, medical examiner Dr. Lorren Jackson testified about the autopsy report, explaining why his office determined Wright's death to be a homicide.
Were those toxicology results that you received in any way significant with respect to your determination of cause and manner of death?
No, they were not.
And then on exam, did you find any natural disease or natural defect that would have caused Mr. Wright's death?
No, the only thing we found were injury-related changes associated with the gunshot wound.
And now, Dr. Jackson, based on your training and experience, did you ultimately determine a cause of death for Daunte Wright in this case?
Yes.
And what was the cause of death?
The cause of death in this case was gunshot wound of the chest.
And did you also determine a manner of death for Daunte Wright?
Yes, this is certified as a homicide.
And what is the definition of homicide with respect to your work?
Homicide is death at the hands of another.
And we just heard that medical examiners say that his death is ruled a homicide. All right, joining us now to help us break down what we just heard, we got our legal panel, criminal defense attorney and private investigator Karen Nance. We also have BNC's chief legal correspondent, Laura McNeal. All right, Karen, we'll start with you. We heard the medical examiner declare Wright's death a homicide. So why is Potter being charged with manslaughter?
Well, because she is a police officer and she was acting the line of duty. And the charges are count one, which is the first degree, is whether it was reckless, and second, whether it was negligent. So we have to look at whether the prosecution does not have to prove intent in this case. And so we're just looking at her conduct and whether it fits into one or both of the categories of manslaughter in this case.
How do you think the medical examiner's testimony will impact those charges? Will it, Karen?
I don't believe so. I think that the jury's going to be focusing on the lineage of video that we have from cam videos and others. We have many viewpoints to look at it, angles to look at it, and I think that at this point there is obviously the medical examiners just already know that it's a homicide. So the issue is getting into the mind of Kim Potter and her actions and whether those were consistent with not the intent, but with us or negligence of her actions, which caused the death of Daunte Wright.
Yeah. Laura, on the stand last week, we saw Officer Michael Johnson, Kim Potter's supervisor at the time of the shooting. Now, he was on the stand for a lengthy amount of time. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was 2 full days almost. He said that Potter had the right to use deadly force. Why?
Yeah, he did. He was obviously there at the scene, one of the officers trying to arrest Daunte Wright. And one thing that's well established in law enforcement is that you can use the level of threat, a level of force, commiserate with the level of threat. And he's saying that there was possible deadly harm that could have occurred if Daunte Wright had pulled off while they were still halfway inside that car. He said on the stand, I could have been drugged, seriously injured, or even killed. And he said, so in that sense, because that car could have been used potentially as a deadly weapon based on his testimony, that Officer Potter had the right to use deadly force, even if it was intentional, even if it wasn't a mistake, as we see in this case of her thinking it was her taser.
Yeah. So, Karen, I'm going to piggyback off of that response. Is that why prosecutors took a lot of time asking Johnson to pinpoint if he was inside or outside of that car prior to the shooting taking place?
I believe so. And also, I think that a point that hasn't been focused on is that Officer Johnson was in the process of trying to arrest Daunte Wright. He had his hands, at least one hand in handcuffs. And he said that when he heard Officer Potter say taser, taser, he kind of let up a little bit. And I think that there hasn't been enough focus on that. If he had exercised his diligence in what he was doing, he would have been able to handcuff him and it would have been a different outcome. I haven't seen the prosecution focus on that aspect. It looks like the officers they're a team, right? They're supporting each other as a fraternal order, and they are basically covering Kim Potter's back and covering their own backs as well in their testimony and what actions they took at the scene.
Yeah, Karen, that's an interesting outlook. What are your thoughts on that, Laura? Do you think they didn't spend enough time discussing that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I think that is pivotal to this case because you want to establish, for instance, if you're the defense, that there was an ongoing threat. But if you're the prosecution, you want to establish the complete opposite, of course, that he didn't pose a threat. There were three officers. There's 3-on-1 trying to subdue him. They already had one of his arms in a handcuffs. And so was it reasonable, the level of force that they were using? So I think that is super important, and they should spend more time on that.
Yeah. What do we know about the law there in terms of when someone is trying to get away in a vehicle? Do you just let them go? Are you supposed to chase after them? I know certain states, they don't initiate a high-speed chase. They'll just let that person go and catch up with them.
Yeah, interestingly enough, this wasn't technically a high-speed chase. They weren't chasing him. But yes, there are a lot of jurisdictions that say, you know what, it's not worth the potential threat to public safety. You don't want a little kid crossing the street in his bicycle getting hit by someone who is fleeing from the police. But in this case, it was not appropriate for them to, again, let him leave once they had that warrant because they were trying to arrest him based on the warrant. But if he was posing a threat to public safety, yes, they should have simply stepped away. But it seemed like they were convinced, based on what I've heard thus far, that they would be able to simply arrest him and take him into custody. But unfortunately, things didn't go as planned.
Yeah. Karen, I want to ask you this question. On the stand when Johnson was on, right, last week, he said that after Potter shot Wright, he was concerned that she might hurt herself. Is he saying she was suicidal?
We'll get the video afterwards, both her body cam and that of Johnson. It appears that she's extremely distraught. And there was some concern. I believe there was actually testimony that that he removed her gun from her. And I believe he gave her his. I'm not really sure the protocol with that, but clearly she looked distraught. It can be looked at two ways. One, was she distraught because she, as she indicated, maybe I'm going to go to prison or going to go to prison. So the concern was more for herself than for the person that she shot. And I don't know if she knew at that point that she had killed him. I think that there was information that came over there that he wasn't, and then she became more and more distraught. So I think that as a woman, we're looking at it and not necessarily as an officer. I think that if there was a male police officer, and he reacted that way, I don't think that the sympathy would be there as it is with Kim Potter. And I think that doesn't help the prosecution to show that it's not an issue of whether she was upset or been upset. The focus should be on her actions with regard to the taser and the gun, not with regard to how she responded afterwards.
Yeah, Laura, why is that important though? How she responded after, and if she if he did feel that he was concerned for her safety, excuse me.
Well, it's very important because it goes into the defense's narrative that this was an honest mistake. There was no ill intent involved. There was no recklessness. This was an honest mistake. And seeing Kim Potter's reaction on that body cam footage is very helpful to her case, because one thing a jury wants to see is remorse, empathy. They don't want to see an officer like we saw with Derek Chauvin, who showed no empathy, no type of concern that a loss of life had just occurred. So that helps humanize Kim Potter.
All right, ladies, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.